Welcome to Margaret Nel, and how lovely to be sitting here in your unusual and charming home in Pretoria, and we're on the top of Mentjieskop and with this beautiful view. Tell us a bit about the house before we start on your art.
The house was built in the early 1960s, and it's a house, a mid-century house. It's very specific to that period, very few in Pretoria. My husband had it built by a firm of architects, and the South African architect was, or engineer, was actually Mar van Langenau, who was German trained. And it was probably one of the first cantilevered residential houses in Pretoria. And it's still a beacon. People still remember, if they know that I live here, they will say, oh, we went to visit it when it was being built. And it was such an unusual shape and unusual building, and people still talk about it. It's still a beacon. You can say, oh, the Round House, and oh, I know the Round House, and yes.
And I mean, we're here in October, and for me, one of the is looking out over the Johannesburg, and then these beautiful jacaranda trees that Pretoria is so famous for, and you have an almost 360-degree view of this wonderful South African landscape with all its history and the many painters that lived and worked in Pretoria. Which brings me to you and your painting practice. And where did you start, Margaret?
We came to Pretoria when I was in my late teens. I grew up in a small town south of Johannesburg. My father was a principal of a primary school. They were politically very active. My parents, they were very liberal, despite the fact that they were from an Afrikaans background. And when I was a teenager, we really were forced actually to go into self-imposed exile in Swaziland for some years. I was sent to boarding school in Johannesburg, and then we then later on came to Pretoria after my mother's death. And I studied at the art school in Pretoria, and my first major exhibition was in 1974, and I've had several solo exhibitions since then. A big retrospective in 2017, and
where was that retrospective?
That was at the Pretoria Art Museum.
Wonderful, and a big body of work in that retrospective?
Yes, it was. They've got a lovely space. I mean, it's very, and we used both the North Gallery and the South Gallery, and we were able to include work from the very early 1974, my very early works, to my later works, which are mainly still lifes from around about 2006 to the present day.
And I've had the privilege of walking around and looking at some of your paintings before we started the interview. And I noticed that in many of your paintings there's a lone figure, possibly two, but just generally a lone figure. And how did that develop?
I think very many of the paintings of this particular period, which I call the postmodern period, but in my website it's called Barren Land, I found the period a very sort of cathartic period, because I grew up as an only child, and when we moved due to for political reasons, my friendship group, I lost my friendship group, and I lost my sort of family support after my mother's death, I was about 15, and so I think the whole idea of, or the experience of isolation, of being an outsider, was really something that influenced me a lot in my early work and in my later work as well.
And we see that quite clearly in the painting that is on the Strauss Co November live sale, Waiting for the Renaissance. So let's start with the title, The Waiting for the Renaissance.
The history of the painting is quite interesting. In 1998, I saw an exhibition of Peter Schutz's work at the old Goodman Gallery, which was in Hyde Park. And I was so struck by his sculptures, by the images of the sort of the eternal pariah, the outsider, the martyr. And the painting was initially based, actually, it was called The Martyr. And in 1999, I was asked to participate in an exhibition called Leonardo Posted. There was a sort of traveling exhibition that was about Leonardo's work as a scientist, as an artist, and as an inventor. And the Art Association director, Reno Grissel, asked various local artists if they would participate in an exhibition which coincided with this traveling exhibition. And I was really flummoxed. I couldn't get a handle on exactly how I would. It was just difficult for me. And I thought, well, maybe let me look at my old work, and maybe I could get some sort of direction. And I thought then, and I looked at this particular painting, I thought, well, maybe that might be that it references the Renaissance. Thabo Mbeki had made a speech to the United Nations about the African Renaissance, about the rebirth.
And this was around about 1998, 1999. Yeah.
And I thought, well, let us put it in the African context rather than in the actual Renaissance, 15th century context. And that was how the name then came about.
That was the name for the African Renaissance. But in this, the model appears, and I believe it's autobiographical.
It is. My daughter was the model. She modeled for quite a lot of my paintings, but the paintings are actually personal. They are autobiographical. They speak to my own traumas.
Yes, and the model in the painting looks ill-prepared for the harsh landscape that she's sitting in. And is that part of your feelings of how you...
The harsh landscape is really a metaphor, I think, for psychological damage, for personal psychological damage. And we, as South Africans, live in a harsh climate. It's from childhood. There's always been this talk of rain or no rain, or when is it going to rain, and we travel through very barren landscapes. And the previous paintings, the figures had been in an isolated space, but in a room, or in a room that has been demarcated. And I then started to set the figures in a landscape. And the landscape then became a metaphor for psychological damage, for personal trauma, and the tiles were then actually used to indicate perspective and distance. And there's often a sky also that is with looming clouds.
Yeah, the sky in this one is quite a dark, foreboding sky, dramatic, I'd say, and also the elements that surround the model.
Yes.
The traffic cones, the stones, and the peeled apple.
Look, the stones were originally, as I say, the original title was The Martyr, and one of the martyrs was St. Stephen, and he was stoned, so the stones were an indication. So it was really, but it is a stony landscape, it is a barren landscape, so the stones fitted in quite well. But one can read the painting on various levels. You know, one can read it almost from a religious aspect, if you would like to, the martyr aspect, but one can also read it as personification of myself and my own traumas. There is also a political aspect, the African Renaissance, so there are various interpretations.
The other thing that struck me in the painting is the tone of the skin, the very pale skin, and the garment that the model's wearing.
Look, I mean, the garments always are, particularly of the female child, are always very flimsy. They can't protect her from the sun. The sun that we have is extremely harsh. One has to protect oneself from it. A metaphor again for how fragile the human spirit is.
And the skin?
The skin, I found, because one always had to, when my children were small, always had to wear sun protection. And when one looks at school photographs, the Van Heerdens are my married name. The Ghanaians are the ones with the very white faces, you know, the rest are healthily tanned, you know, so skin was always an issue, and protection of the skin. Yeah.
Very and vulnerable again, the metaphor for the vulnerability. Yes. And then with your so many of your subjects being painted in isolation, how have you found the current situation that we're in with the COVID pandemic and the isolation of so many?
Well, I think it for me, being a person that is used to being isolated, and I work in isolation. I mean, I paint in my studio on my own, and so it was a very productive period for me, because I wasn't tempted to go to malls or to go to have coffee with friends or to go and visit people. But I think it just brought it home, you know, that isolation is actually isolation is a universal issue. People are isolated for whatever reason. Children are bullied at school. You either are bullied or you witness bullying. The pariah is people are isolated because of their religion, maybe because of their culture, because of their ideology, because of their gender. So, yes, and absolutely, and of course age also.
Age.
Yes.
And so how have your paintings post, well, I suppose in the new millennium, how have they developed and changed?
I've always been interested in female issues, and the frailty and the vulnerability of the female with these paintings, but with subsequent paintings also. So I've had to find ways that are not too overt, not too blatant, to talk about female aging and female objectification and violence against the female. And it has been difficult to find metaphors, but I have been able to. I've used still life as metaphors for these to portray these issues, and I found it actually very interesting. Still life has always been actually part of my part of a figurative painting. It's always been an element. Apple denotes innocence.
And in your work and your practice, do you always know when a painting's finished?
Yes. One works until it's done. And as my daughter would say as well, one knows when the work is done. You work until it's finished. And there's just a moment, you know, which is almost the creative moment. I mean, all those hours of work that go into it, and that's almost a moment of satisfaction that you have when you know, okay, it is finished. Sometimes one does rework, and I've reworked many paintings, but there's a moment when you feel, okay, I'm quite happy with that.
It's like that last full stop in a book.
Yes, yeah.
Well, Margaret, it's wonderful, and we're very excited to have the Waiting for the Renaissance on the Strauss Co sale, and I hope that this has given some insight into your work.
Yes, well, I certainly hope so.